The shopping center was buzzing with the usual noise of a busy Saturday afternoon. People were walking in every direction, carrying heavy bags filled with new clothes and gifts. The smell of pretzels and coffee hung in the air. But today, the center of attention wasn't a store or a food court. It was a small stage set up near the big fountain. This was the day of the annual city talent show. It wasn't a fancy event, just a fun thing for locals to enjoy. But the crowd was large and judgmental. A young man had just finished singing a pop song. He wasn't very good, and he forgot some of the words, but the crowd clapped politely because he looked nervous and cute. The host, a woman with a very loud voice and a bright purple dress, walked back to the microphone. She smiled at the audience and checked her clipboard. "All right, thank you for that," she said, trying to sound excited. Next up, we have Elias. The name didn't mean anything to anyone in the crowd. They looked around, wondering who Elias was. From the side of the stage, an older man stepped into the light. He didn't look like the other performers. Most of the people before him were young, dressed in shiny outfits or trendy jeans. Elias looked like he had just come from a long day of work. He was wearing a thick, dark coat that had seen better days. The fabric was worn out at the elbows. There were small holes near the pockets. His pants were baggy and held up by a simple belt. On his feet, he wore heavy brown work boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles. They were dusty and scuffed. His hair was gray and messy, sticking out in places as if he hadn't combed it in a week. He looked to be in his late 60s or early 70s. He had a rough face, with deep lines on his forehead and cheeks that told the story of a hard life. Normally, when someone steps onto a stage, they look a little scared. They look at the crowd and swallow hard. They might give a shy wave. But Elias did none of those things. He walked with a strange kind of power. He didn't shuffle. He marched. He kept his head held high, looking straight ahead, ignoring the hundreds of eyes staring at him. He walked past the microphone stand without even glancing at it. This confused the host, but she stepped back to let him do his thing. He walked straight to the grand piano standing in the middle of the stage. It was a nice instrument rented for the event, shiny and black dot. As Elias approached the piano, the mood in the room began to change. The polite smiles on people's faces started to fade. A low murmur went through the crowd. It was that sound people make when they are confused or when they think something is about to go wrong. The shoppers stopped sipping their drinks and turned their full attention to the stage. It felt like the air suddenly got heavier. "Who is this guy?" A young man whispered to his girlfriend near the front. He was wearing a stylish jacket and sunglasses on top of his head. "I don't know," she whispered back, covering her mouth so no one would hear her laughing. "He looks like he's lost. It looks like he's here to fix the piano, not play it," the boyfriend joked. He wasn't the only one making jokes. A group of teenagers stood near the edge of the crowd, holding their phones up. They weren't recording because they were fans. They were recording because they wanted to make fun of him later. They pointed at his boots and his old coat. To them, Elias looked like a joke. He looked out of place. He looked like someone who didn't know where he was, but Elias acted as if he were in a royal palace. He didn't look nervous at all. In fact, he looked almost annoyed, as if the crowd were a distraction to him. He reached the piano and stood beside the bench. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood there, looking at the instrument with a serious, critical eye, like a doctor examining a patient. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small white rag. It looked like a cleaning cloth. He leaned over the piano and started to wipe the keys. He wiped them hard. The sound of the cloth rubbing against the plastic was barely audible over the hum of the crowd's whispers. He wasn't just being clean. It looked aggressive. He acted as if the keys were dirty and beneath him. "Is he serious right now?" someone shouted from the back. A few people giggled. Elias ignored them completely. He finished wiping the keys and put the rag back in his pocket. Then he grabbed the sides of the piano bench. He picked it up and moved it 2 inches to the left. He stood back and looked at it. He shook his head, unsatisfied. He grabbed it again and moved it an inch forward. He did this 3 times. The crowd began to get restless. They came here for a show, not to watch an old man move furniture. The awkwardness grew. The teenagers near the front started nudging each other and laughing louder. They thought his behavior was ridiculous. It looked like arrogance. It looked like this old, poorly dressed man thought he was too good for the stage. "Grandpa," one of the boys yelled out, "just play the song already." A few people around him laughed nervously. The host looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, wondering if she should stop him or tell him to hurry up. Elias finally seemed happy with the position of the bench. He slowly sat down. He didn't just drop onto the seat. He lowered himself down carefully, keeping his back perfectly straight. He smoothed the front of his coat with his hands. Then he placed his hands on his knees. He looked out at the audience. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stared with a cold, focused expression. It was the kind of look that made people feel small. He didn't care that they were laughing. He didn't care that he didn't belong there in their eyes. "Looks crazy," a woman whispered to her friend. "Total ego trip," the friend agreed. "Look at his face. He thinks he's a superstar." Elias lifted his hands and hovered them over the keys. He cracked his knuckles, one by one. The sound popped through the microphone, making a few people jump. The crowd was now fully against him. They were waiting for him to fail. They wanted to see him embarrass himself so they could go back to their shopping with a funny story to tell. "You $10, he plays chopsticks," the boyfriend in the front row whispered. The air was filled with tension. It was uncomfortable. The noise of the mall seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy expectation of failure. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the first clumsy note. Elias closed his eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath. The smile on the teenagers' faces grew wider. They were ready to laugh, but then Elias opened his eyes and his hands dropped. They didn't drop softly. They struck the keys like lightning. The sound that exploded from the piano was not the simple plink-plink of a beginner. It was a massive, thundering chord that vibrated through the floorboards. The laughter in the room vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, sharp silence. Elias's fingers began to move, blurring as they danced across the keyboard. And just like that, the mockery was over. The first sound that came out of the piano was not what anyone expected. It was loud, deep, and angry. Elias had hit the keys with so much force that his hands seemed to bounce off them. The noise wasn't just a single note. It was a storm of sound that crashed over the crowd. It was like a sudden thunderclap on a sunny day. The teenagers in the front row stopped laughing immediately. Their faces went from smiling to confused in a split second. The young man with the sunglasses dropped his phone slightly, his mouth hanging open. Elias did not look at the crowd. He did not look for approval. His eyes were locked onto his hands, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. Just a minute ago, he looked stiff and tired, like he could barely walk. But now, his fingers were flying. They were a blur of motion, dancing up and down the keyboard. The music he played wasn't a simple, happy tune. It was complicated and intense. It sounded like a mix of classical music and fast-paced jazz. The bass notes were heavy and strong, shaking the floor of the stage, while the higher notes were sharp and clear, cutting through the air like a knife. The silence in the mall spread quickly. It started near the stage and moved outward like a ripple in a pond. People who were walking by the fountain stopped talking. The baristas in the coffee shop paused while making drinks. Even the little kids who were running around stopped to stare. The only sound in the huge building was the roar of the piano. The teenagers who had been mocking him looked at each other, their faces turning red with embarrassment. They realized too late that they had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a crazy old man. This was a master at work. The boy who yelled out earlier sunk his hands deep into his pockets and looked down at his shoes, wishing he could disappear into the floor. The contrast was shocking. Looking at Elias, you saw a messy, gray-haired man in dirty work clothes. But listening to him, you heard a genius. The music was so beautiful that it made people forget about his appearance. They forgot about the ragged coat and the scuffed boots. All they could see was the passion in his playing. He was leaning into the piano now, his head bobbing slightly to the rhythm. He looked like he was fighting a battle, and the piano was his sword. The complexity of the song was mind-boggling. The tune kept changing. One moment it was soft and gentle, like a quiet rain, and the next moment it exploded into a fast, furious rhythm. Elias's left hand was playing a steady, driving beat while his right hand played melodies that seemed to weep and sing at the same time. The music had so much emotion in it. It sounded lonely, then proud, then joyful. It felt like he was telling a story without using any words. The host. The woman in the purple dress was standing frozen near the curtain. She had been ready to step in and help him if he struggled, but now she couldn't move. She was holding her clipboard to her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had seen hundreds of performers in this mall, usually kids trying to be pop stars or people playing acoustic guitars. But she had never heard anything like this. She glanced at the judges sitting at their long table. They weren't writing anything down anymore. They were just staring, their pens resting on their paper in the audience. A mother holding a young child's hand whispered, "Do you hear that? It's beautiful." The child, usually noisy and fidgety, stood perfectly still, mesmerized by the sound. The music was strong enough to reach anyone, no matter how young or old. Elias was lost in his own world. He didn't care that hundreds of people were watching him. To him, they probably weren't even there. He was playing for himself, or perhaps for a memory only he could see. Every time he hit a high note, his face would scrunch up with effort. When he played the soft, quiet parts, his eyes would close, and a small, peaceful smile would appear on his face. It was the kind of smile that showed he was truly happy, a happiness that didn't depend on applause. The shoppers who had just come to buy clothes were now hypnotized. A man in a business suit who had been arguing on his phone 5 minutes ago hung up the call without saying goodbye. He took off his glasses and wiped them, just to have something to do with his hands because he was so moved. The music was demanding their attention. It was forcing them to stop their busy, stressful lives for a few minutes and just listen. As the song went on, it became faster and more difficult. The notes were coming so fast that it sounded like rain pouring down on a tin roof. Most people can't even imagine moving their fingers that quickly. Yet Elias made it look easy. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. He knew exactly where every key was. It was clear that he had spent thousands of hours sitting at a piano. His hands might have been old and wrinkled, but they knew the language of music perfectly. The people in the back of the crowd, who couldn't see Elias very well, pushed forward. They wanted to see who was making this incredible sound. When they saw the old man in the shabby coat, their jaws dropped. They couldn't believe that this ordinary-looking person was the source of such magic. It was a powerful reminder that you cannot judge a book by its cover. Everyone had judged him the moment he walked on stage, and they were all wrong. The atmosphere in the mall had completely changed. The cynical feeling was gone. The judgment had vanished. It was replaced by a sense of awe and respect. People were looking at each other with wide eyes, silently asking, "Can you believe this?" It was one of those rare moments where a large group of strangers all feel the exact same emotion at the same time. The music had connected them all. Suddenly, Elias slowed the pace down. The storm of notes calmed into a gentle, flowing river. He played a soft melody that tugged at the heartstrings. It felt sad but hopeful. The audience held their breath, afraid that if they made a noise, the spell would break. You could hear a pin drop in the entire mall. Even the air conditioning unit seemed to hum quieter. Elias's hands moved gracefully now, caressing the keys instead of hitting them. He played with a touch that was incredibly delicate. It showed that he had complete control over his strength. He could be as loud as a thunderstorm or as soft as a whisper. This kind of control takes a lifetime to master. The teenager who had been recording him on his phone lowered his device. He wasn't recording anymore. He was just watching. The mocking look on his face was gone, replaced by a look of genuine wonder. He realized that this old man had more talent in his little finger than most people would ever have in their whole lives. The boy felt a sudden pang of guilt for being so mean earlier. Elias was nearing the end of the piece. He began to play chords that built up the tension again. The music started to rise, getting louder and deeper. He started playing with both hands high up on the keyboard, then jumped down to the low notes, creating a dramatic sound that made everyone's heart beat faster. He was building towards a finale, and everyone knew it. The anticipation was electric. He wasn't looking at his hands anymore. He was looking straight ahead, his eyes focused on something invisible in the distance. His face was intense. The muscles in his jaw were tight. He was putting every ounce of energy he had left into this performance. It felt like he was pouring his soul out into the music, leaving nothing behind. Just when the crowd thought the music couldn't get any more powerful, Elias stood up slightly from the bench, leaning over the keys, and brought his hands down for the final chords. It wasn't just one sound. It was a series of crashing, wave-like sounds that filled the entire space. The piano seemed to sing its heart out. He played a final, lingering note that rang out beautifully and then slowly faded into silence. Elias held the pose, his hands hovering over the keys. He sat there for a moment, catching his breath. The silence that followed was even heavier than the one before. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the stage, overwhelmed by what they had just heard. It was as if time had stopped. The shock was so strong that nobody knew how to react. The transformation of the old man from a figure of fun to a figure of awe was complete. For a long time, the silence stretched on. It wasn't a quiet, peaceful silence. It was a heavy, shocked silence. The final note of the piano had faded away, but the sound seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Hundreds of people stood frozen, staring at the stage. Their minds were trying to process what they had just witnessed. The transformation had been so sudden, so complete, that it felt like a dream. Just minutes ago they were ready to laugh, and now they felt like they had been hit by a truck. Elias sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, his chest rising and falling visibly. He was catching his breath. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and disappeared into his gray hair. He didn't look at the crowd. He just stared at the piano keys, as if they had just told him a secret. He looked exhausted, but in a good way. Like a runner who has just finished a marathon and knows he gave everything he had. Then, a single pair of hands started clapping. It was the older lady standing near the front, the one who had been holding her child's hand. She clapped slowly and respectfully. That small sound broke the spell. Suddenly, the entire shopping mall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. People started shouting bravo and encore. The noise was deafening. It's bouncing off the high ceilings and the glass walls of the stores. The teenager in the front row, the one with the sunglasses, didn't know what to do with his hands. For a second, he just stood there, looking guilty. Then, he started clapping too, harder than anyone else. He wanted to show that he wasn't making fun anymore. He wanted to show that he understood. His friends joined in, their faces red with embarrassment but full of excitement. They had just witnessed something legendary, and they knew it. The energy in the room had flipped completely. The judgment, the cynicism, and the arrogance of the crowd were gone. In their place was a raw, genuine admiration. It was a powerful moment for everyone there. They realized that they had almost missed this experience because of their own prejudice. They had judged a man by his coat and his boots, and they had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Elias slowly stood up from the piano bench. He turned to face the audience for the first time since he started playing. The spotlight hit his face, revealing the deep lines of age and weariness. He didn't smile a big, fake celebrity smile. He didn't throw his hands in the air. He just stood there, looking tired but dignified. He gave a small, slow nod to the room. It was a nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. It was as if he was saying, "I heard you, and now I am done." The host, the woman in the purple dress, rushed onto the stage. She was flustered, her cheeks pink. She held the microphone out to Elias, her hand shaking slightly. She had seen a lot of performers in her time, but she had never seen a reaction like this. The crowd was going wild. That was incredible. She stammered into the microphone, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Sir, that was absolutely beautiful. What is your name? And tell us, where have you been playing?" Elias looked at the microphone. He didn't take it. He just leaned forward slightly. He didn't seem interested in the fame. He wasn't there for an interview. He looked at the host, then at the cheering crowd, and then back at his hands. "Just Elias," he said. His voice was rough and gravelly, like stones rubbing together. It was the voice of a man who didn't talk much. The crowd cheered even louder at the sound of his voice. They hung on his every word. But Elias didn't say anything else. He didn't tell them a long story about his life. He didn't make a speech. He simply turned back to the piano. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rag again. He proceeded to wipe the keys down one last time. It was the same strange, aggressive motion he had done before he started. He wiped the fingerprints away with care. He treated the instrument with more respect than he treated the people. He treated the piano like an old friend. When he was satisfied, he gently closed the lid over the keys. It made a soft, final thud that seemed to say the show was truly over. The crowd began to chant, "One more song." One more song? The stomping of feet created a rhythmic thumping on the floor. People were leaning over the barriers, trying to get closer. They wanted more. They felt that one song wasn't enough. It was like eating one chip when you were starving. They needed the full meal. But Elias shook his head. He put his hands up, palms out, in a stopping motion. He wasn't being rude. He was being firm. He had played what he needed to play. He had given them a piece of his soul, and that was all he had to give for today. He didn't want to push his luck. He didn't want to ruin the moment by playing something that wasn't perfect. He grabbed his worn coat from the back of the bench and shrugged it on. He buttoned the buttons slowly, taking his time. He was in no rush to leave, but he was definitely leaving. The energy was changing again. The excitement was turning into curiosity. People wanted to know who he was. Where did he learn to play like that? Why was he dressed like a laborer? Why was he here? A security guard, a big man who had been standing near the side of the stage, stepped forward. He wasn't there to kick Elias out. He was there to guide him. The guard looked at Elias with a look of pure respect. Usually, the security guards had to deal with drunk people or rowdy teenagers. This was different. The guard offered Elias his arm to help him down the small steps at the side of the stage. Elias waved the arm away. He didn't need help. He walked down the steps on his own, his boots making a heavy, clunking sound on the wood. He walked toward the gap in the barrier where the judges were sitting. The 3 judges stood up as he approached. That was a sign of great respect. Usually, the judges sat while the performers came to them. But Elias was different. He wasn't a contestant looking for a score. He was a musician. One of the judges, a stern-looking woman with glasses, reached out and shook his hand. She said something to him that no one else could hear, but she was smiling warmly. Elias nodded, his face remaining serious, and shook her hand firmly. He didn't stop to talk to the other judges. He didn't wait for them to give him a score. He walked right past the long table. The crowd in front of him parted like magic. They didn't just move. They scrambled to get out of his way. The teenagers who had mocked him earlier pressed their backs against the wall to let him pass. They looked at him with wide eyes, hoping he wouldn't look at them with anger. But Elias didn't look at anyone with anger. He didn't look at them at all. He just looked forward. He walked through the shopping mall, but the walk felt different now. Before, people had looked at him with disgust or amusement. Now they looked at him with awe. Strangers stopped him as he walked. "Sir, that was amazing." A woman in a business suit said, "Do you have a CD? Do you play anywhere else?" Elias didn't answer. He just kept walking. He moved with the same heavy, deliberate pace he had when he arrived. He didn't seem to enjoy the attention. If anything, he seemed annoyed by it. He pulled his collar up higher around his neck, trying to hide his face. It was clear that he didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He just wanted to play. He walked past the coffee shop. The baristas came out from behind the counter to watch him go. They clapped their hands, which were covered in foam. One of them whispered, "I wish I knew who he was." As Elias got further away from the stage, the noise of the mall started to return. The spell was slowly breaking for the people left behind, but the memory of the music stayed with them. Groups of people were already gathering, talking excitedly. "Did you see his hands?" one person asked. "I've never heard anything like that," another replied. "He must have been a professor somewhere," a third person guessed. But no one knew the truth. They were just guesses. Elias was a mystery. He was a ghost who had drifted into the mall, played a masterpiece, and was now drifting back out into the world. The most interesting reaction was happening near the fountain. A middle-aged man was sitting on a bench staring at the spot where Elias had disappeared. He was wearing an expensive suit and looked very important. He had a look of shock on his face. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just thinking. He looked like he recognized Elias, or maybe he recognized the music. He pulled a phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, as if he was searching for a name. But then he shook his head and put the phone away. He couldn't believe it. The man on the stage and the person he was thinking of couldn't be the same person, could they? Elias reached the exit doors of the mall. They slid open automatically, letting in a blast of fresh air. It was colder outside than in the mall. The noise of the traffic and the city rushed in to fill the silence around him. He didn't look back, not once. He didn't glance at the stage or the people cheering his name. He just kept walking forward, heading toward the bus stop on the corner. He sat down on the hard wooden bench at the bus stop. He leaned his cane against his leg and exhaled a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him feeling very tired. His hands were trembling slightly. He rubbed them together to warm them up. To anyone walking by on the sidewalk, he just looked like an old man waiting for a bus. They had no idea that he had just changed the mood of an entire shopping center. They had no idea that inside that old, tired body lived a genius. The bus pulled up a few minutes later. It hissed as the doors opened. Elias stood up slowly and climbed the steps. While Elias rode the bus toward his quiet, empty apartment, the storm he had left behind at the mall was only just beginning to grow. The shopping center was usually a place where people went to spend money, not to feel emotions. But tonight, the rules had changed. The air inside the building felt different. It felt electric, charged with a mystery that no one could shake. The talent show tried to continue, but it was useless. The host introduced a young girl who played the violin. She was talented and she played a beautiful song, but the magic was gone. The judges held up their scorecards, giving her high marks, but their hearts weren't in it. They kept looking at the empty piano bench. The audience clapped politely, but it was a hollow sound. It was like drinking water after you have just tasted the finest wine. It did the job, but it wasn't exciting. People started leaving the main atrium. They didn't leave because they were bored. They left because they wanted to talk. They gathered in small groups near the escalators in the food court. Strangers were talking to strangers, something that almost never happens in a big city. Did you see his face when he started playing? A woman in a red coat asked a man standing next to her. He looked like a completely different person. "I know," the man replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "I felt like I should stand up. It felt like a church in there." The teenagers who had mocked Elias were sitting at a table in the food court, staring at the video on their phone. They weren't laughing anymore. They watched the clip over and over again, zooming in on Elias's hands. "I feel like a jerk," the one with the sunglasses said, his voice low. "We almost ruined it. We were so loud. It's crazy," his friend said. "My grandma listens to this kind of music, but I never thought an old guy like that could be so cool." They decided to do something good. One of the boys took the video and uploaded it to a popular video sharing site. He titled it simply, "The Legend at the Mall." In the description he wrote, "We laughed at him, but then he made us cry. You have to hear this. They didn't do it for likes. They did it because they felt the world needed to see what they had seen. They wanted to find out who he was." Backstage, the atmosphere was tense and confused. The staff members were scrambling, trying to figure out if Elias had filled out any paperwork. Usually, every performer has to sign a form giving permission to be filmed and to collect a prize if they win. The event manager was a young woman named Linda. She was frantically searching through a stack of papers on a table. "Find the form," she shouted to a helper. "We need his contact information. The judges want to talk to him. He might be disqualified if he didn't sign in, but we have to find him." They searched through every pile. They looked under the microphone stands. They asked the security guards, but there was no paperwork. There was no entry form for Elias. It just walked in, sat down, played, and walked out. He was a ghost who had slipped through the cracks of their system. The judge with the glasses, the stern woman who had shaken his hand, was standing alone in the corner. Her name was Mrs. Gable. She was a retired music teacher who had spent 30 years listening to students play scales and simple songs. She had seen thousands of pianists in her life, but she had never seen hands move like Elias's. She couldn't get the image out of her head. The way his fingers danced across the keys, the look of pure peace on his face when he played the soft notes. It wasn't just skill. It was soul. She knew with every bone in her body that this man was not an amateur. He was a professional who had played on the biggest stages in the world. But why was he wearing work clothes? Why was he playing in a shopping mall? Mrs. Gable decided to go home early. She couldn't sit there and listen to any more amateur singers. She gathered her things and walked out to the parking lot. As she drove home, her mind was racing. The music Elias played was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It felt like a song she had heard a long, long time ago in a dream. When she got to her house, she went straight to her study. It was a small room filled with books and old vinyl records. She turned on the lamp and sat at her desk. She started looking through her old collection of music magazines. She pulled out dusty issues from the 1970s and 80s. She remembered a story about a prodigy from back then. A young man who was called the next big thing, but he had vanished without a trace. She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking slightly. She found an article about a young pianist named Elias. The picture showed a handsome young man with a tuxedo and a bright smile. He was shaking hands with a famous conductor. The article said he had the potential to be the greatest pianist of his generation. But then the article stopped. There was no follow-up. No one knew what happened to him. Mrs. Gable stared at the photo. The eyes were the same. They were younger and brighter in the photo, but the intensity was identical. The man at the mall was definitely him. But why did he disappear? She remembered a rumor she had heard once at a music conference. Someone had whispered that the young prodigy had to quit to take care of his family. They said he gave up his dream to work in a factory so his sick sister could get medicine. If that was true, then Elias was a hero. He had sacrificed his fame and his talent to do the right thing. He had lived a life of hard work and silence, carrying his music inside him, waiting for the right moment to let it out. Meanwhile, the video on the internet was exploding. It wasn't just getting a few views. It was going viral. Within a few hours, millions of people had watched it. The comment section was flooding with reactions. "Who is this man?" wrote a person from another country. "I am crying at work right now." "This is so beautiful," wrote a nurse on her break. "Does anyone know where he lives?" "Someone needs to sign him to a record deal immediately." People were analyzing the video like detectives. They zoomed in on his boots. They debated what kind of coat he was wearing. Music teachers were posting slow-motion videos of his hands, explaining the techniques he used. They pointed out that he was playing complicated chords that usually take 2 hands to play, but he was doing them effortlessly. The video even reached the news. A local television station saw it trending online and decided to run a story about the mystery piano man. They showed clips of the performance and interviewed the teenagers who recorded it. The teenagers looked serious on TV, talking about how they learned a lesson about judging people. "We thought he was a joke," one of them said on camera. "But he taught us that you should never judge a book by its cover. He is the coolest guy I've ever met." The story spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the human spirit. It was about the idea that greatness can be hiding anywhere, even in an old man with dirty boots. People loved the story because it gave them hope. It made them feel like the world still had magic in it. But for Elias, the world was very small and quiet. He was sitting in his small kitchen, eating a bowl of vegetable soup. His apartment was modest and simple. There were no photos on the walls, no trophies on the shelves. The only sign of his passion was an old upright piano in the corner of the living room. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and had a stack of mail sitting on top of it. He hadn't played that piano in years. It was too painful. Playing used to remind him of everything he lost, of the career he never had, of the stages he never played. But today, something had changed. When he sat at the mall piano, the anger and the regret were gone. He just felt the joy of playing. He felt like he was thanking the world for the music, not blaming it for his hard life. He finished his soup and washed the bowl in the sink. He looked out the window at the city lights. He had no idea that thousands of people were looking for him. He had no idea that millions of people were listening to his music on their phones. He just knew that his fingers ached a little bit, but his heart felt light. The next morning, the hunt for Elias began in earnest. Mrs. Gable. The judge contacted the television station. She told them about the article she found. She gave them the name of the prodigy who vanished. She was convinced it was the same man. The station decided to launch a search campaign. They put his picture on the morning news, asking the public for help. "If you know this man, or if you know where he lives, please contact us," the news anchor said. "We want to give him the recognition he deserves." People all over the city started looking. They looked at the bus stops. They looked in the diners. They looked at the construction sites. Everyone wanted to be the one to find the mystery man. They wanted to be the person who brought the legend back to the light. It became the biggest story in the city. But the true ending to the story wasn't about finding him on a map. It was about understanding what he truly needed. He didn't need money. He didn't need fame. He just needed to know that his music had been heard and that it had mattered. And deep down, perhaps that was enough for him. But the world wasn't ready to let go just yet. They needed one more moment, one final piece of the puzzle to understand the full depth of the man who had laughed at them with his confidence and then silenced them with his soul. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, but the atmosphere in the town was different. The story of the mystery piano man was no longer just a local rumor. It was the main topic of conversation everywhere. It was on the radio, on television screens and shop windows, and on the lips of every person waiting for the bus. The city was gripped by a fever to find him. Mrs. Gable, the retired music teacher and judge, woke up with a mission. She hadn't slept well. Her mind was racing with thoughts of the young prodigy from the past and the old man from the mall. She was convinced they were the same person. She felt a heavy responsibility to find him. It wasn't just about applauding his talent. It was about acknowledging a life that had been dedicated to sacrifice. She didn't wait for the news stations to find him. She got into her car and drove to the part of the city where the factories and warehouses were. She remembered reading a tiny footnote in an old music magazine years ago that mentioned the prodigy had family in the industrial district. It was a long shot, but she had to try. She drove slowly down the busy streets. Looking at the people walking on the sidewalks, she saw construction workers, delivery drivers, and people waiting for shifts. They were the invisible people who kept the city running, the same kind of people the shoppers at the mall usually ignored. She wondered how many other hidden geniuses were walking among them after hours of searching. She pulled into the parking lot of a large shipping warehouse. It was a gritty place. It's filled with the noise of forklifts and the smell of diesel fuel. Mrs. Gable parked her car and walked toward the main entrance. She felt out of place in her nice coat and dress shoes. But she didn't care. She walked to a small bench near the loading dock, where workers were taking their break. She scanned their faces, and then she saw him. He was sitting on a wooden crate, eating a sandwich wrapped in plastic. He was wearing a gray work uniform with a name tag that said Elias. Mrs. Gable stopped walking. Her heart started beating fast. It was really him. He looked tired. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were rough and stained with grease. He looked nothing like the powerful figure who had commanded the piano the night before. He looked like a tired old man taking a break from a hard job. She gathered her courage and walked over to him. Elias looked up, sensing someone standing in front of him. He finished chewing a bite of his sandwich and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He looked at her with those same deep, serious eyes. "Can I help you, lady?" he asked. His voice was rough and tired. "If you're looking for the manager, he's inside." Mrs. Gable shook her head gently. She felt tears stinging her eyes. "No, Elias," she said softly. "I'm not looking for the manager. I'm looking for the pianist." Elias froze. He slowly put the rest of his sandwich down. He looked at her more closely, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I saw you last night," he said quietly. "You were the judge." Yes, Mrs. Gable said. She sat down next to him on the crate, not caring that it was dusty. I know who you are, Elias. Or I should say I knew who you were. I found the old articles. I know about the concerts you played when you were young. I know about the promise everyone said you had. Elias looked down at his greasy hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. The noise of the warehouse beeping trucks and shouting men seemed to fade away. That was a lifetime ago, Elias finally said. His voice was barely a whisper. That boy is gone. Why did you stop? Mrs. Gable asked gently. The world lost something beautiful when you quit, Elias sighed, a deep, heavy sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. I didn't quit because I stopped loving the music, he said. I quit because I needed to live. He looked up at the sky, remembering the past. My sister got sick. It was a long time ago. We had no one else. Someone had to pay for the doctors. Someone had to pay for the medicine. I couldn't do that if I was traveling around the world playing concerts. So, I put the piano away. I bought these work boots. He looked down at his shoes, and I went to work. Mrs. Gable sat in silence. She had guessed the truth, but hearing it made it real. He had given up his dream to save someone else's life. He hadn't failed. He had sacrificed. That was why he played with such emotion. He wasn't playing notes. He was pouring out a lifetime of unexpressed grief and love. You didn't just work, Mrs. Gable said. You played for us last night. And now, everyone wants to know you. The video has millions of views. People are crying, Elias. They are inspired by you. Elias looked skeptical. They don't want me, he said. They want the show. They want to feel good for 5 minutes and then go back to their lives. Look at me. He held up his hands. I am not a star. I am just a worker. You are a musician, Mrs. Gable corrected him firmly, and you deserve to be heard. Just then, a commotion started at the entrance of the warehouse. A news van had pulled up. A reporter with a camera crew was rushing toward them. They had followed Mrs. Gable. The secret was out. Elias stood up quickly. He looked uncomfortable. He put his hands in his pockets and turned to walk away. I don't want this, he said, shaking his head. Leave me alone. Elias, wait. Mrs. Gable stood up and grabbed his arm gently. Don't run. You don't have to become a celebrity if you don't want to. You don't have to go on TV or sign record deals. But you do need to know that you matter. Your music matters. The reporter arrived, breathless. Sir, are you the piano man from the mall? Can we get an interview? The world wants to know your story. Elias looked at the camera, then at the reporter, and finally at Mrs. Gable. He saw the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't asking him for money. She was asking him to accept the respect he had earned. He took a deep breath and decided to stay. He didn't want to hide anymore. He answered their questions, but he did it in his own way. He didn't talk about fame or regret. He talked about the music. He told the camera that music isn't about how you dress or how rich you are. It's about what is inside your heart. I played yesterday because I needed to, he told the reporter. I didn't care who laughed. I knew what I could do, and I think that's the lesson for everyone. Don't let the world tell you who you are. You tell the world. The interview aired that evening. It was short, but it was powerful. Seeing the old man in his work clothes standing proudly among the crates moved people even more than the video had. They saw his dignity. They saw that greatness doesn't always wear a tuxedo. Sometimes greatness wears a dusty uniform and work boots. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Elias didn't go on a world tour. He didn't move to a mansion. He kept his job at the warehouse because he liked it, and it was his life. But the city wanted to thank him. A wealthy local music school heard his story and offered to fix his old piano at home for free. Elias accepted. When the technicians were done, the old instrument sounded brand new. But Elias still didn't play it much. He was content. However, he'd agree to one request. Mrs. Gable asked him if he would play at the local children's hospital. She didn't ask him to go there as a celebrity, but just to play for the kids who were sick, just like his sister had been. Elias agreed. He went on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't wear his work clothes, but he didn't wear a tuxedo either. He wore a clean shirt and nice pants. He sat down in the playroom, which was filled with children in wheelchairs and hospital gowns. He started to play. It wasn't the thunderous storm he played at the mall. This time, he played soft, gentle lullabies. He played Disney songs and folk songs. The children gathered around him, their eyes wide. The music made them forget their pain for a little while. It made them smile. A little girl with a bandage on her arm reached out and touched Ilias's hand while he played. He stopped for a second, smiled at her the biggest. Warmest smile anyone had ever seen on his face, and then kept playing with just one hand so she could hold the other one. The nurses stood in the doorway, Stace wiping away tears. The parents, who were exhausted from worry and hospital bills, sat down and let the music soothe them. In that room, Elias wasn't a mystery or a viral sensation. He was a healer. He was using the gift he had sacrificed years ago to bring comfort to others. Just as he had sacrificed his career to comfort his sister, he realized then why he had played so fiercely at the mall. It wasn't to show off. It was because he remembered the value of his gift. He had kept it locked away for too long, thinking it was useless for a man like him. But now he knew better. The music wasn't for him. It was for everyone else. Months passed, and the buzz around the mystery piano man faded, as all internet fame eventually does. The news crews stopped calling. The teenagers found the next viral video to watch. Life in the city went back to normal, but for the people who were there that day at the mall, for the children at the hospital, life was a little bit brighter. They learned a lesson about judging people. Elias still rides the bus. He still sits on the wooden bench near his apartment window. But sometimes, if you walk past his door in the evening, you can hear the sound of a piano drifting out into the street. It is not a performance. It is just an old man, enjoying the company of his oldest friend. And sometimes, when he walks down the street, people recognize him. They don't laugh at his boots or his old coat anymore. They nod at him. They smile. They might whisper, "That's him. That's the piano player." And Elias just nods back, a small, confident sparkle in his eyes. He knows